You don't belong here.
They laughed while she threw him into the rain. He didn't shout, he didn't fight back, he just let them. The crowd outside the gallery on West 24th Street watched the manager grab the quiet man in the gray hoodie by the elbow and shove him backward into the rain. She was shouting that he had no business standing in her doorway looking like a vagrant. People filming on their phones laughed when his shoulder hit the brass door handle and his canvas bag slipped from his hand and spilled $4,200 in cash across the wet sidewalk. A security guard kicked the bills toward the gutter like they were trash. Two well-dressed art buyers stepped around the man as if he were a puddle. Nobody offered to help him pick up the money. Nobody asked his name. They just stared and they smiled and they kept on filming. Then the manager looked down at the small framed sketch the man had been holding under his arm. The frame had cracked when he fell. The glass was shattered. The drawing beneath was smeared and torn at one corner. She bent forward to look at the face on the paper. She went completely still. Her hand dropped to her side, her painted lips parted. The phone in her other hands slipped and clattered onto the marble step. It was a charcoal portrait of a woman with deep eyes and a faint scar along her left jawline. A woman who had been dead for 23 years. A woman almost nobody in this city remembered. A woman whose name nobody on this sidewalk had ever spoken aloud. But the manager knew that face. She knew it because she had erased it from her own life a long time ago. The man in the gray hoodie was Keanu Reeves. He was 59 years old. He had taken the C train down from his hotel near Columbus Circle that morning, the same way he always traveled when he was in New York. He wore a faded gray hoodie with a small hole near the left cuff, blue jeans that had been washed so many times the color was almost gone, and a pair of black motorcycle boots that he had owned since he was 32. He had no driver waiting outside. He had no bodyguard. He had no assistant whispering into a headset. He carried a worn canvas messenger bag over one shoulder and a framed charcoal sketch wrapped in brown paper under his arm. He stepped into the gallery the same way. He stepped into a corner deli with no announcement and no expectation. He was carrying the last piece of a promise he had made to a stranger 29 years ago. The manager's name was Catherine Whitmore Pierce. She was 47. She had grown up in a 6-bedroom colonial in Greenwich, Connecticut. She had studied art history at Brown and earned her master's at Yale. She wore a black wool dress that cost more than most people in that neighborhood made in a month. And she stood in front of her gallery with her chin lifted like a woman who had never, in her life, been told no by anyone who mattered. She believed she was protecting standards. She believed she was protecting culture. She believed that the people she pushed out of her doorway were not people, they were problems, and that her job was to remove problems before they offended the right kind of customer. The gallery she ran was called Halverson and Whitcomb Contemporary. It sat on a quiet stretch of West 24th, between a wine bar and a furniture showroom. Inside, the walls were white, and the floors were polished concrete, and the air smelled faintly of lilies. Catherine had been the on-site director for 9 years. The owner, an elderly philanthropist named Edward Halverson III, lived most of the year in Newport and trusted her completely. She had built her reputation on selling expensive paintings to expensive people. She had not built it on kindness. Keanu had walked into her gallery at 10:47 on a Saturday morning in late April. He had come because the painting hanging on the back wall of the gallery, a small framed portrait priced at $186,000, was a piece he had been searching for since the summer of 2003. The painting was of a homeless woman with gray hair and a kind face. The artist had died in a hospice in Queens 3 years earlier. The painting had been pulled out of a storage unit in Long Island City and bought at auction by Catherine, who had no idea who the subject was. To her, it was just inventory. To Keanu, it was the closest thing he would ever have to a photograph of a woman who once saved his life. He had brought the framed charcoal sketch as proof. It was a smaller drawing of the same woman, signed by the same dead artist, given to Keanu personally in 1998. He had wanted Catherine to see it. He had wanted to explain who the woman in the painting was. He had wanted to pay full price in cash and walk out quietly with the painting under his arm. He had not wanted any of what happened next. Catherine had taken one look at his hoodie, his boots, the canvas bag, the unshaven jaw, and the long hair tucked under a black baseball cap. And she had told him the gallery was by appointment only that day. Keanu had said very softly that he had called ahead the day before. Catherine had said more loudly that she did not see his name in the book. Keanu had said even more softly that he had spoken to a young woman named Hannah. Catherine had said, sharply enough that the other customers turned to look, that there was no Hannah on her staff, and that he needed to leave immediately, or she would call the police. Then she had stepped forward and put her hand on his elbow and pushed him toward the door. The security guard had grabbed his other arm. The brown paper around the framed sketch had torn. The frame had fallen. The glass had broken. And $4,200 in cash, the partial payment Keanu had brought as a gesture of seriousness, had spilled across the sidewalk in front of strangers, who pulled out their phones and laughed. Keanu did not raise his voice. He did not argue. He just bent down slowly in the rain and started picking up the bills. One at a time, while a teenage girl in a yellow raincoat recorded the whole thing on her phone and giggled. But inside the gallery, Catherine was staring at the broken sketch on her marble step, and her hands had started to shake. The face in the drawing belonged to a woman who used to feed homeless people behind a parking garage on Pico Boulevard in West Hollywood. A woman who used to wear an oversized army jacket and carry a thermos of black coffee. A woman who had once given a young Catherine Whitmore, Pierce, then a 20-year-old art student running from her family, a sandwich and a place to sleep on a piece of cardboard for 3 nights in November of 1998. A woman Catherine had spent the next 26 years pretending never existed. The woman's name was Maggie Donovan. Nobody in the art world had ever heard of her. She did not show in galleries. She did not paint on canvas. She lived on the streets of Los Angeles from 1993 until she died of pneumonia in 2003. And the only people who knew her name were the other homeless men and women's she shared sidewalks with, and a handful of strangers she had quietly kept alive through the worst nights of their lives. Maggie had been a high school art teacher in Bakersfield once. She had lost her husband and her teaching license in the same year, 1991. After a long and ugly battle with depression, she had walked away from her old life and never gone back. But she still carried a small sketchbook in her coat pocket. Everywhere she went, she still drew faces. She drew the faces of every person who shared a meal with her, every person who slept under the same overpass, every person who treated her like she was still a human being. She gave the drawings away. She never sold a single one. She used to say that art was not something you owned. It was something you handed to another person. So could they carry themselves a little farther down the road. In November of 1997, Keanu Reeves had spent 4 nights sleeping in an alley off Santa Monica Boulevard while researching a film role. The film never got made, but those 4 nights changed him in ways he never talked about in interviews. Maggie had been one of the people who shared that alley with him. She had not known who he was. She had not cared. She had given him half of her sandwich on the 2nd night, and a wool blanket on the 3rd. And she had drawn his portrait in charcoal on the 4th. And she had told him, sitting on a piece of flattened cardboard at 3 in the morning, that the loneliness he was carrying was not a punishment. It was just weather. Weather always changes if you stay alive long enough to see the next morning. A year later, in the autumn of 1998, Keanu had gone back to that alley with a paid hotel room and a bag of new coats and a stack of meal vouchers. Maggie had refused the hotel room. She had accepted a coat. She had introduced him to a young art student from Connecticut who had been sleeping behind the parking garage for 2 weeks. The art student had run away from a wealthy family in Greenwich after a violent argument with her father. She was 20 years old and angry and ashamed and starving. Maggie had been keeping her alive with sandwiches and coffee and quiet conversation. Keanu had given the girl $500 in cash and a bus ticket to anywhere she wanted to go. The girl had taken the money and the ticket. She had not said thank you. She had walked away into the dark and never looked back. Her name was Catherine Whitmore Pierce. Maggie Donovan had drawn her portrait the night before she left. Maggie had given the drawing to Keanu and asked him to hold on to it because she had a feeling, she said, that the girl was the kind of person who would spend the rest of her life trying to forget where she came from. And someone, Maggie had said, ought to remember her clearly. Someone ought to keep a picture of the girl she was, before she got rich enough to lie about it. Keanu had kept that drawing in a locked drawer in his house in Los Angeles for 26 years. He had not brought it with him to the gallery that morning. The charcoal sketch in the broken frame was a different one. It was Maggie's self-portrait, drawn the same week she drew Catherine. He had brought it to prove a connection to the painting on the back wall, the larger oil portrait of Maggie that he wanted to buy. But Catherine had recognized her own past in the broken glass on her doorstep, and for the first time in 26 years, she had no idea what to do with it. Outside, Keanu finished picking up the bills. He stood up slowly. His knees were wet. His hair was wet. He folded the cash carefully and slid it back into his canvas bag. He picked up the framed sketch with both hands, very gently, the way a man picks up a broken bird. He turned around and started walking east towards 6th Avenue. He did not look back at the gallery. He did not have to. A young woman was running down the sidewalk toward him from the other direction. She wore a brown work apron over a t-shirt, and her hair was pulled into a tight bun. Her face was flushed and her breath was short. Her name was Hannah Whitfield. She was 24 years old. She had been working in the basement framing room of Halverson and Whitcomb Contemporary for 11 months, mounting and matting other artists. Work for $15 an hour. She had been listening to the whole confrontation through the floor vent. Hannah was a painter herself. She had grown up in Akron, Ohio, the only child of a hospital nurse named Daniel Whitfield. Her father had worked the oncology ward at Akron General for 31 years. He had died of pancreatic cancer in the summer of 2022. Before he died, he had told Hannah a story about a long-haired patient's brother who used to sit overnight in the family lounge during a sister's leukemia treatment in the late 1990s. The brother had been quiet and kind and never once acted like he was anyone important. The brother had given Daniel a small charcoal drawing of a homeless woman one night, signed by an artist named M. Donovan, and had asked Daniel to hold on to it until he found someone who needed it more than he did. Daniel had kept that drawing in a manila envelope in his dresser for 24 years. He had handed it to Hannah 3 days before he died. He had said very softly that someday she would know what it was for. Hannah had moved to New York 6 months after her father's funeral. She had brought the drawing with her. She had taken the gallery job specifically because Halverson and Whitcomb had announced an upcoming exhibition of works by lesser-known mid-century American artists, and a small footnote in the catalog had mentioned the name M. Donovan. Hannah had been trying for months to find anyone in the gallery who would tell her how that name had ended up in their inventory. Catherine had brushed her off every time. Hannah caught up to Keanu at the corner of 6th Avenue and 24th Street. She was breathing hard. She said his name. He stopped. She held out a small manila envelope that had been folded in half and stuffed inside her apron pocket. She said her father had told her that someday she would meet a quiet man with long hair who would know who Maggie Donovan was. She said her father had described him exactly. The hoodie, the boots, the way he never looked anyone directly in the eye for very long. She said her father had died, trusting that someone in this city would eventually need this drawing back. She handed him the envelope. Keanu opened it on the sidewalk in the rain. Inside was a small charcoal sketch on yellowed paper. It was Maggie, younger than in the painting on the gallery wall, smiling at something off the edge of the page. There was a small scribbled note in the corner. In handwriting Keanu recognized immediately. For the kind man in the alley. Remember, the weather always changes. MD 1997. Keanu's eyes filled. He stood on the corner of 6th Avenue, holding a piece of paper a dead woman had drawn for him 29 years earlier, and a dying nurse had carried across a continent to return to him. And he did not say a word for a very long time. The rain kept falling. The taxis honked. The crosswalk signal changed 3 times. Then he looked up at Hannah and he asked her one question. Why did the manager of the gallery throw him out today? Hannah told him everything. She told him that Catherine had been running a quiet side operation for almost 4 years. Catherine had been buying paintings from estate sales for a few $1,000s apiece, paintings by little-known artists whose families did not understand the work was worth more, and reselling them through her gallery for prices 10 and 20 times what she paid. The Maggie Donovan painting on the back wall had been purchased from a storage auction in Long Island City for $3,100. Catherine was asking $186,000 for it. The estate of the artist who had inherited it, an elderly widow in Astoria named Ruth Beckman, had received nothing. Catherine had told her the painting was unsigned and worthless. Catherine had quietly removed the signature on the back of the canvas with a chemical solvent before the sale closed. Hannah said there were at least 3 other artists in the same situation. A painter from Newark named Marcus Hollings, whose late father's work had been bought from his mother for $200 and resold for $47,000. A widow in Astoria named Ruth Beckman, a janitor from Queens named Daniel Reyes, whose grandmother had been a self-taught folk artist in the 1960s, and whose entire collection of 12 paintings had been purchased from him for $900 while his grandmother was dying in hospice. Catherine had sold the collection in pieces for a total of $312,400 over 14 months. Hannah had the paperwork. She had been quietly photographing receipts and emails for 6 months. She had been waiting for the right person to bring them to. Keanu listened. He did not interrupt. He held the small drawing in one hand and Hannah's stack of evidence in the other. When she was finished, he asked her if she would walk with him to a coffee shop on 7th Avenue. She said yes. They walked together in the rain. In the coffee shop, at a small table by the window, Keanu made one phone call. He called Edward Halverson III in Newport. He spoke for 11 minutes. Halverson said almost nothing on the other end. When Keanu hung up, he told Hannah that Edward had asked one favor. Edward wanted to be present when the truth was put on the table. Edward was already in his car. Edward would be in Manhattan in 3 hours. Keanu and Hannah waited in the coffee shop. They did not talk much. They drank black coffee and watched the rain. At one point, Hannah asked him what kind of man Maggie Donovan had been. Keanu thought about it for a long time. Then he said she had been the kind of person who treated everyone the same, whether they were rich or poor or famous or invisible, and that the world did not have enough of those people, and that the few it did have tended to die quietly and unnoticed, and that was the great unspoken tragedy of every century. Hannah nodded. She did not say anything for a while. Then she said her father had been that kind of person too. Keanu reached across the table and put his hand briefly on hers. He said, "Then your father is not gone. People like that do not disappear. They just hand themselves forward." At 3:12 in the afternoon, Edward Halverson III walked into the gallery on West 24th Street. He was 81 years old. He used a silver cane. He wore a tweed jacket and round wire-rimmed glasses. He was followed by his attorney, by Hannah Whitfield, by Marcus Hollings, by Ruth Beckman in a wheelchair pushed by her granddaughter, by Daniel Reyes in his janitor's uniform, and by a quiet man in a gray hoodie carrying a broken framed sketch under his arm. Catherine was sitting at her desk when they came in. She had been crying. The mascara under her left eye was smudged. She stood up too quickly when she saw Edward. She tried to smile. Edward did not smile back. He asked her to sit down. He asked her one question. He asked her if she remembered a homeless woman on Pico Boulevard who had given her a sandwich in November of 1998. Catherine opened her mouth. She closed it. She opened it again. Edward laid the broken frame sketch on her desk, the drawing of Maggie. Then he laid down a second drawing, the one Hannah had handed Keanu that morning. Then he laid down a third drawing, a portrait of a young woman with frightened eyes and a hospital bracelet on her wrist, drawn in charcoal on a piece of brown paper. The signature in the corner read M. Donovan, 1998. The young woman in the third drawing was Catherine. She had not seen the drawing in 26 years. She had not known it existed. She had assumed Maggie had thrown it away, the same way Catherine had thrown away every memory of that month on the street. Catherine looked at the drawing for a very long time. Her hands started to shake. Her shoulders started to shake. Tears ran down her face, and she did not bother to wipe them. She did not lift her chin. She did not defend herself. She did not say a single word about gallery protocol, or appointment policies, or unkempt customers. She said, in a voice almost too quiet to hear, that she remembered Maggie's hands. She said Maggie's hands had been red from the cold, and that Maggie had handed her the sandwich without looking at her. Because Maggie had known that hungry people sometimes need to eat without being watched. She said she had spent 26 years trying to become a person who could afford to forget that sandwich. She said she had built her entire life on top of that forgetting, and now the foundation had cracked, and she could see it clearly for the first time. And she did not know how to live with what she had become. She looked up at Keanu. She looked at Hannah. She looked at Marcus and Ruth and Daniel. She said the word she had not said in 26 years. She said, sorry. Edward placed his hand gently on her shoulder. He said it was not enough. But it was a beginning. He fired her that afternoon. He instructed his attorneys to file a full criminal referral to the New York County District Attorney's Office regarding the resale fraud. He directed the gallery to immediately return the Maggie Donovan painting to its rightful owner, which after some research turned out to be the Homeless Services non-profit that had inherited Maggie's belongings after her death. He directed the gallery to pay full restitution to Marcus Hollings, Ruth Beckman, and Daniel Reyes from the gallery's reserves, totaling $471,200. He directed Hannah Whitfield to take over the framing and acquisitions department as interim director. At a starting salary of $96,000 a year, Catherine listened to all of it without arguing. She walked out of the gallery at 5:47 that evening with one cardboard box of personal items and no coat. It had stopped raining. The sidewalk was still wet. She stood at the corner of 6th Avenue, holding her box, and she did not know which way to walk. Keanu was standing a few feet away. He had been waiting. He did not say anything cruel. He did not gloat. He just walked over and handed her a folded piece of paper. It was the original drawing Maggie had made of her, the frightened young woman with the hospital bracelet, the girl who had once been someone worth feeding. He said, "This is yours. Maggie wanted you to have it. I have been holding it for you for a very long time." Catherine took the drawing. Her hands were shaking. She looked at the face of the girl she used to be. She nodded once, very slowly. She walked east into the dusk. She did not know where she was going. She had nothing left of the life she had built, but she had the drawing. 6 months later, Catherine Whitmore Pierce pled guilty to 4 counts of wire fraud and 2 counts of grand larceny in New York County Supreme Court. She was sentenced to 32 months in a minimum security federal facility in Danbury, Connecticut, and ordered to pay full restitution from the sale of her Greenwich apartment. She did not contest the charges. She wrote a personal letter of apology to each of the 4 victims. The letters were long. They were not slick. They were not designed to win sympathy. They were the words of a woman who had finally stopped running from herself. Ruth Beckman read her letter twice and then put it in a drawer. Marcus Hollings burned his in the kitchen sink. Daniel Reyes folded his and carried it in his wallet for a year. Hannah Whitfield did not open hers for 8 months. When she finally did, she sat at her kitchen table and read it slowly. And then she walked into her studio and started a new painting. And she did not stop until it was finished. The painting was of 2 women on a sidewalk in 1998. One was wrapped in an army jacket. The other was 20 years old and shaking. Between them was a sandwich wrapped in wax paper. Above them was a street lamp. Below them was a piece of cardboard. Hannah called the painting "The Weather Always Changes." It hung in the front window of the gallery, which had been renamed the Donovan Project, under Edward Halverson's direction. The gallery no longer sold paintings. It gave them away. Every 6 months, a new artist who had once lived without a home was invited to show their work and to take any piece they wanted from the permanent collection. The rest of the inventory was donated to public schools and community centers across the 5 boroughs. Keanu attended the opening of every new exhibition. He never gave a speech. He never stood for photographs. He just walked through the rooms slowly, looking at each painting, sometimes for a long time, and he always shook the hand of the artist before he left. 1 year after the day on West 24th Street, Catherine Whitmore Pierce was paroled from Danbury. She did not return to the art world. She did not return to Greenwich. She moved to a small apartment in Yonkers and took a job as a part-time art teacher at a community center for unhoused women on East Tremont Avenue. She taught drawing on Tuesday and Thursday evenings. She brought her own pencils. She did not charge for materials. She never told her students who she had been or what she had done. She kept Maggie's drawing of her younger self pinned above her kitchen sink. Every morning, when she stood at the sink washing her single coffee cup, she looked at the drawing for a moment before she turned on the tap. She did not always cry. Sometimes she just nodded. She was learning, slowly, how to be a person Maggie would have been willing to feed again. On a quiet Saturday in late October, almost 18 months after the morning at the gallery, Hannah Whitfield walked into the community center on East Tremont Avenue with a small wrapped package under her arm. She had not told Catherine she was coming. She found Catherine sitting at a folding table with 3 older women, showing them how to shade the curve of a cheekbone with the side of a charcoal stick. Catherine looked up, and her face went pale. Hannah did not say anything for a moment. Then she walked over and set the package on the table. Inside the package was a small oil painting. It was a portrait of 2 women on a sidewalk in 1998, one in an army jacket, one in a hospital bracelet. Between them, a sandwich wrapped in wax paper. There was a folded note attached to the back of the canvas. The handwriting was Hannah's. It said, "My father told me once that the people who hurt us are sometimes the same people who can teach us the most about who we want to become. I do not forgive what you did, but I see who you are becoming, and I think Maggie would have wanted you to have this." Catherine sat at the folding table holding the painting. The 3 older women around her watched in silence. The afternoon light came in through the window and fell across the canvas. She did not say thank you. She did not have the right words yet. She just nodded once, very slowly, and she pressed her hand flat against the painted sandwich in the middle of the canvas, and she closed her eyes. A billionaire who had once slept in an alley because he wanted to understand what loneliness really felt like. A homeless woman who had spent her last 10 years feeding strangers from her coat pocket. A nurse from Ohio who had carried a small drawing across a continent and into his daughter's hands. A young painter who had walked into the rain to return a piece of paper to the man it belonged to. And a woman who had spent 26 years pretending none of them had ever existed, until the day they all walked back into her life and asked her gently and firmly to remember. Sometimes the people the world looks past are carrying the weight of love. Nobody else can see. Sometimes the man in the worn hoodie is holding a piece of paper that has been waiting 29 years for a doorway. Sometimes the woman who throws him out is the same girl he once handed a bus ticket to in the dark. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And the next time a stranger walks into your life, looking like they do not belong there, ask yourself one question before you turn them away. What grief, what kindness, what unfinished promise might they be carrying that you cannot see from where you are standing? Because the weather always changes. And sometimes the only thing that gets us through to the next morning is the sandwich. Somebody else was brave enough to hand us in the dark.